All right, today we're zeroing in on a single fascinating timeline that has suddenly appeared on the horizon. A specific year that a lot of people are now pointing to as the potential end of the war in Ukraine.
It's the question on everyone's mind, isn't it? For years, predictions have been all over the place. But now, all of a sudden, one particular year keeps coming up.
And that year is 2026. Now, I know, it might sound a little random, but there's a real and growing belief, especially inside Russia, that this is when the fighting is finally going to stop.
And look, this isn't just some wild guess or speculation. This timeline is coming directly from brand new polling data from Russia's own state-run pollster. It shows a really significant shift in how people are thinking. Let's take a look at the data.
So first up, the 2026 peace timeline. We're looking at a new poll from VTSCOM, which is the official Russian Public Opinion Research Center, and it's showing a major shift.
The main takeaway here is, well, it's pretty startling. For the first time, a clear majority, 55% of Russians surveyed, are saying they think the war will be over by the end of 2026. That's a huge deal, because it's the first time such a specific, near-term deadline has really taken hold in the public mind.
And it's not just about the war ending. This is tied to a much bigger feeling of optimism. A staggering 70% of Russians are expecting 2026 to be a more successful year for their country than 2025. So what in the world is driving all this confidence?
Well, according to the pollsters themselves, the official reason is a belief that Russia is on the verge of victory, that the special military operation is going to wrap up with Russia achieving all its goals. But, as you can probably guess, that is only one side of the story.
Which brings us to our next section. Confidence versus exhaustion. Because when you start looking at data from independent sources, a much more complicated story starts to emerge. One that's about both official confidence and a really deep public fatigue.
And you can really see the two different narratives playing out here. On one hand, you have the state poll framing this desire for peace as confidence and victory. But then you look at Russia's most respected independent pollster, the Levada Center, and you see something else entirely. A record-high 2/3 of Russians want to move to peace talks. And support for continuing the war? It's cratered to just 25%, the lowest it's been since this all started. It really seems like the push for peace is coming just as much from sheer exhaustion as it is from confidence.
So that's the big question, right? Why 2026? What is so special about that year? Well, it's definitely not an accident. It looks like it's a perfect storm, a convergence point for three really powerful forces.
It really boils down to these three things, all coming to a head in 2026. You've got geopolitics, especially how people in Russia see U.S. policy potentially changing. Then you've got a very real military deadline that's fast approaching. And finally, there's a super important political event on the calendar right at home.
Let's just zoom in on that military reality for a second. Analysts have been crunching the numbers, and they've realized that Russia's massive stockpiles of old Soviet-era tanks and artillery, well, they aren't bottomless. They're projecting that by late 2026, those reserves are going to hit a critical exhaustion point. That's going to make it way harder to keep fighting at the same intensity.
Okay, so if a deal is actually on the table for 2026, what would Russia demand? What would a peace deal look like from Moscow's point of view? The Kremlin has been getting more and more clear about its non-negotiables, its so-called red lines.
First up, the land. Russia's territorial demands are, to put it mildly, maximalist. As you can see, they want full annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. That would mean Ukrainian forces have to pull back from areas they are still holding right now. They also want to freeze the front line in the south and have permanent control over that huge nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia.
And it doesn't stop with territory. The other demands are basically designed to completely neutralize Ukraine. We're talking about changing their constitution to ban them from joining NATO, putting strict limits on how big their army can be, and absolutely no foreign military presence on their soil. Ever.
Now, what's really interesting is that there's this other piece of the puzzle that seems to be fueling Russia's optimism, a potential American-led peace plan. A draft framework has been floating around, and it seems Moscow is looking at it as a pretty workable way forward.
But Ukraine's reaction? Yeah, not so positive. In fact, President Zelensky has called one of the key proposals to use frozen Russian assets in a joint fund with Russia to rebuild. He called that insulting. It just goes to show you the massive diplomatic canyon that still separates the two sides.
And finally, let's not forget about what's happening inside Russia. Remember that third driver? The Kremlin has parliamentary elections coming up in September 2026. And the goal isn't just to win. The plan is to use that election to officially bring in deputies from the occupied parts of Ukraine, which would cement their annexation.
A messy, ongoing war makes that whole narrative a lot more complicated.
But here is the massive catch. Even with all these things pushing toward a 2026 deal, the hardest, most fundamental disagreements haven't been resolved at all. We're talking about the final, deal-breaking sticking points.
You know, you often hear diplomats use this phrase, right? That both sides are 90% of the way there. The problem is that final 10%, well, that's where the entire reason for the war actually lives.
And this table just lays it out so clearly. On every single key issue, from the Donbass to NATO to the nuclear plant, the two sides aren't just far apart, they are in completely different universes. Russia is demanding total surrender on these points, while Ukraine is demanding security and its own sovereignty.
So where does that leave us? The momentum for something to happen in 2026 is very real. It's being pushed by military realities, political calendars, and public opinion. But are those forces powerful enough to bridge that final, fundamental 10%? Or is this 2026 timeline just a convenient illusion, hiding a divide that's as uncrossable as it's ever been?